say for Arab neighbors, and even for Israel, the overriding concern is all the bad activities the Iranians could be up to under the cover of a nuclear umbrella. Most analysts and security analysts in the region, including Israelis, by the way, do not think that the prime ministers are in their story, but most security analysts do not think that the Iranians are so irrational that they would push the button and launch a nuclear weapon on any of the states. Because, truthfully, the Iranians, for better or worse, often for worse, are very interested in survival. So one thing you know for sure is that if they thought about launching a nuclear weapon on, let's say, a country like Israel, there would be ways for Israel to defend itself. We'll leave it at that. So most people weren't concerned about the specific nuclear threat. It's about the other activities Iran is engaged in the region. And this is where there's so much concern post-nuclear deal about the ways in which this deal could embolden Iran in the broader region. So that, I think, is the primary concern. And that is already playing out in various proxy conflicts that I just identified. Andy's going to get into them in more depth in terms of Iraq and Syria. And Syria is really the epicenter of this proxy war. And the, I think, strongest actor in this proxy conflict in the region is the Saudis, who are considered the leaders of the Sunni world. And they're kind of in the geostrategic rivalry with Iran, the major Shia power. And Saudis, yeah, I mean, there's concern about proliferation. If Iran gets a bomb, we want a bomb. I think there's a lot of alarmism about that. I'm not losing sleep about it. There was more worry about that before Iran's program was rolled back with this deal. I think now, post-deal, you're less likely to have the proliferation cascade. And in any fact, I think the cascade effect was highly exaggerated. It is not that easy to acquire a nuclear weapon, thankfully. So I think it's not something we should forget about, but I don't think we should be alarmist about it. But what they are worried about, again, is the non-nuclear threat that they believe Iran poses to their interest in the broader region. So they want to push Iran back in Iraq, in Yemen, but Syria, again, is the epicenter where you're really having Iran supporting the Assad regime, and the Saudis supporting all of these anti-Assad rebel forces. To be honest, ISIS is the least of anyone's concerns. They're focused on other things. Again, Andy will get into that. That is the big issue. Now, one thing I want to say about this, that is the prevailing concern and narrative in the region. But as an analyst, looking at the geostrategic picture in the region, and I think Mary mentioned the article I wrote about the limits of Iranian power, where I go into this in more depth with a colleague. It's highly exaggerated. The fears are real, and in the Middle East, perceptions matter, so we take them seriously, and actors are actually acting, neighbors are acting on those perceptions, as you see in terms of Saudis pushing back on Iranians in numerous areas. But the reality of Iranian power is much more limited than I think the conventional view often suggests. We really should be careful, both on hard measures and soft measures. Iran is actually in a lot of trouble. If you look at Iran's hard power capability, its forces are extremely outdated. They haven't gotten new combat systems since the early 90s. Their aircraft are mostly from the Shah area. They are outspent by the Saudis 5-1. They are fighting against U.S.-equipped with the best, shiniest, effective weaponry that money can buy, and there's a lot of money in Persian Gulf, or Arab Gulf, that's also a debate. And the Iranians are facing forces that want to push them back in the region. So I would say on a conventional scale, the Iranians are significantly limited. What we do need to worry about is what we call asymmetric capabilities of Iran. That's where the picture of Soleimani is relevant, the Quds Force. They are not Iran's regular army. They're the irregular army, but incredibly dangerous, incredibly lethal, supporting militia groups that killed many Americans in Iraq after the 2003 invasion, are up to all kinds of terrorist-linked activity in the broader region. Those guys are worrisome, no question about it. Iran also has very worrisome missile capabilities. I'll get to that in a second. And very good naval assets in terms of mining. So they use these asymmetric capabilities to kind of make up for their lack of high quality aircraft and tanks and artillery and things that you need to actually fight and win wars. Now the problem the Iranians are facing is they are using these asymmetric capabilities, and they used to use them really effectively because basically they supported groups like Hezbollah, so it was like, they'd fight, the joke was, they'd fight any war down to the last Lebanese or last Palestinian, right? They didn't put their skin in the game. They were willing to support lots of nasty groups doing all kinds of things, especially if it was against countries like Israel, because they were the leader of what was called the Resistance Front. But what we see increasingly since the Arab uprisings and all of this instability and vacuums in the region is increasingly Iran is getting entangled in asymmetric conflicts and is paying a heavy price. You saw the commander that was just killed in Syria. 1,000 Hezbollah fighters that Iran is actively supporting and training to fight Bashar al-Assad in Syria have been killed. Unprecedented numbers for these groups. They are not winning these wars, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Syria. There's a reason they were interested in the Russians bailing them out. They were not winning this war. There were fears that Assad was about to go. So it wasn't a complete coincidence. So they are really, I think, facing some pretty difficult situations. So this narrative of Iran on the march that you're going to read a lot about in papers, just I think is important to put in perspective. And then finally, their soft power has reduced considerably because especially of the conflict in Syria. Now, Iran, as I said, used to tout itself as the best resistant actor there is when it comes to anti-Israel activity, or anti-Zionist as they would call it. Leading Hezbollah, Syria, Hamas, all the actors that were fighting Israel. And they would join forces, not just with Shia groups, because if you look at the map, right, look at this map, the majority of the populations in this region are Sunni. So flaming sectarian conflict, which is what's going on now in all these proxy wars, is a losing proposition for Iran. This is not a good strategy for Iranian victory. They are more and more people, they are becoming targets of Sunni jihadi terrorism, populations despising them. At the height of their popularity in the region, which was 2006, the Israeli-Hezbollah war, Iran backs Hezbollah. Hezbollah kind of gave a pretty bloody nose to Israel. Polling shows that at that time there was 75% approval rating in the Muslim world at large. Forget Sunni Shia, across the Muslim world, because Iran had a cross-sectarian strategy. We're the leader of resistance, we're the Islamic leader, we're not the Shia leader, we're the Islamic leader. Fast forward to just this past year, popularity down to 25%. They are universally despised in the Sunni Arab world for basically doubling down in support of Bashar al-Assad, who is brutally killing and barrel bombing his people, literally to death. 250,000 people now dead. Not just Assad, but the majority by Assad. So Iran is not exactly on the march, invincible, certainly dangerous. I don't want my talk to convey the message that this isn't an actor we need to be vigilant about and worry about. We do. We worry about it, but we need to put it in perspective. So that was point one. And I'll go through the others so we can get to Andy sooner. Israelis. I gave you a little bit of a sense of the Israeli reaction. Now, again, it's not to say that Prime Minister Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders weren't worried about some of the details of the nuclear deal itself. They are concerned about some of them. But again, Israel, like other neighbors of Iran, have other worries that keep them up at night beyond the specific nuclear issue itself, which is about Iran's broader regional behavior. And for them, the missile threat is probably first and foremost the biggest concern, especially the Iranian supply of missiles to Hezbollah, which is Israel's, I think, most lethal actor, and where we could possibly see escalation in the near term. So if you look at that map, where the circle shows you the range of Iranian missiles, not terribly accurate right now. They are improving over time, But unfortunately, Iran's current missile capabilities can reach the entire region, Israel included, and as well as all U.S. bases in the region. So the U.S. has a huge stake in this. You know, I often tell Israeli friends who talk about, well, you Americans don't understand our concern about Iran because we're the ones facing them. And I say, well, actually, we're facing them. You know, our guys have been killed by the Iranians in Iraq. We're facing, our forces, military forces, are facing Iranian missiles in the region. So we're all worried about this threat. What you see from the Israelis, though, and again, the picture of Netanyahu and his statement is, I think, is the popular image of the Israeli response to Iran and the nuclear deal. Generally, as basically, they were the only country who publicly came out officially opposed to the deal. The Sunni Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, did not like the deal, but expressed their displeasure quietly and publicly supported it. Netanyahu did no such thing. He continued to express his concern about this deal, and it's shared by others in the political leadership in Israel, even on the opposition side. But what I think is interesting in Israel is that you do see fissures that have developed in terms of their threat perception of Iran and their views of the deal. And these fissures are not between political leaders, but they're more between the political leaders and the security establishment, the security professionals in the Mossad and military intelligence, IDF, and that's Israel Defense Forces. And among the security officials, there is a feeling, not that they don't worry about Iran, but there is a feeling that the threat has been exaggerated. You just had the former head of the IDF, Benny Gantz, last month saying, really, we don't need to get hysterical about Iran. An IDF strategy report that just came out recently ranked Iran as a low priority compared to the other issues facing Israel today. And they were very upset, many in Israel were very upset, not with maybe the Prime Minister's goal, because nobody wants to see a nuclear-armed Iran, but they were concerned about his style and his tactics, and the way in which he politicized this issue, making it a partisan issue in many people's view in the United States, which potentially jeopardizes the bipartisan support for Israel, which is a real no-no in U.S.-Israeli relations. So there's a lot of concern about the tactics, and a lot of concern that the Prime Minister made this too much about Israel. And a lot of Israeli strategists believe it's not in Israel's interest to make this Israel's fight against Iran, because this is a global problem. Look at that map. Look at all of the capabilities Iran has globally. This is a global problem, which is why we needed a global solution, which we got over the summer. So there was a lot of concern about that, but I don't want to I think it's important to understand these fissures, but the bottom line is there's still tremendous concern across the establishment in Israel, including in security and military circles, about Iranian intentions, and you can be sure that Israelis will be at the forefront of efforts to expose any potential Iranian cheating in this deal, and they fully expect there will be cheating. And they will keep up efforts to confront Iran in other arenas, especially in Lebanon, where you have that very, very tense situation with Hezbollah. We're getting to Andy's topic. Just ignore that map right now, because the last things I'm going to say don't need any slides, so you don't need to look at that for a while, unless you're bored of Iran and you want to get to ISIS. So just a couple words, and the last two issues I want to touch on before moving on to Andy and the Iraq, Syria, getting more in depth into that arena. I think what's also important to understand post-deal, as we leave this summer and we move forward and see how this deal goes forward, it's very important to look at the domestic environment within Iran and how it is playing out. There are a lot of people who argued you could only support this deal if you think it's going to moderate the Iranians. I never argued in favor of this deal because I thought, or I knew, that Iran would become a more moderate country in terms of its regional behavior, in terms of its horrendous domestic human rights and repressive policies, which continue. I did a cost assessment based on an arms control agreement. Nobody knows If someone tells you they know, they don't know. Let me give you that hint right now. Because nobody knows whether this nuclear deal will moderate Iran or will only embolden Iran. And what you have within Iran, and this is the key thing, are there's many factions, but to make it simple, two most relevant factions are more hardline elements who really some who really actually oppose this deal. They think the Supreme Leader crossed his own red lines and gave too much to the US and the West. And then you have those who said, fine, we'll deal with the Supreme Leader because he understands the need for the Iranians to survive and wants sanctions relief, accepts the deal, and the deal, by the way, just went through within Iran, went through their process and was approved, not surprisingly. But the Supreme Leader has been making statements lately, we're not going any further. Don't think this deal is going to do anything in terms of warming up the relations with the United States or changing Iran's broader role. This is an arms control agreement, and that's it. And then you have factions in Iran, well represented by the president of Iran, Rouhani, and the foreign minister, Zarif, who are in the more pragmatic camp. They are much more interested in expanding Iranian engagement with the West, expanding Iranian engagement with even the United States. Foreign Minister Zarif shook President Obama's hand at the UN the other week. He got a lot of pushback in Iran for doing that. So even though we've made a lot of headway, actually, it's so easy to be skeptical in international politics. We can just say, we're going to go back to normal after this deal. Same old. Hillary Clinton just last night apparently said that she's proud that Iran is an adversary. So it's like the same kind of rhetoric continuing. But it is important to keep in mind that we have never had this kind of diplomatic interaction and such a normalized diplomatic interaction between American diplomats and Iranian diplomats that has occurred over the past 2 years. This is unprecedented. And a lot of whether we can move forward beyond this is going to depend on a couple things. One is this internal balance of power within Iran. Who gets the upper hand there? The hardliners, who don't want to go any further and don't even like this deal itself, and support the Soleimani folks who are up to mischief all over the region, or are the pragmatic folks who still believe in the Islamic Republic. So I don't want to go too far here. These are not human rights advocates, okay? They're not exactly Democrats, but they're pragmatic and they're interested in more engagement. They want to open the Iranian economy. They want to use this deal to cooperate with the United States on other potential common areas of interest. Who wins that battle is going to make a big difference on what happens post-deal. Just ending with U.S. policy, my concern is that post-deal, we have not seen the windfall, and maybe it's just too early, but I'm a little worried about the momentum being lost, because even though I'm skeptical, I was never a believer that this deal was going to open the gates to a U.S.-Iranian rapprochement. I mean, there was a lot of concern about that in the Sunni Arab world, but it's not realistic given our political system, given theirs. But there was hope that this deal would be the opening so we could cooperate with Iran on these common enemies, because even though Iran is our adversary in Syria and in so many other theaters, we have a common enemy of the Islamic State. The Islamic State, a fundamentalist Sunni group, is at war with Iran. We have potential common interests with the Iranians, or we have common interests with the Iranians in Afghanistan, because we're both opposed to the return of Taliban rule. One of my colleagues at RAND, Jim Dobbins, negotiated with Foreign Minister Zarif, at the time he was the Iranian ambassador to the UN, and they negotiated a post-Taliban government in Afghanistan. So it's not hypothetical. We have cooperated with Iran to solve issues of common interest in the broader region. So there was a lot of hope that this deal would lead to momentum in that direction. But what have we seen since July 14th, and even, I would say, since the congressional business, that's what I'll call it, I guess, ended? And it's done. The deal is moving forward, whether you like it or not. That's why I'm focused on post-deal, because we are where we are. Let's move forward, whatever you thought. What we see instead of potential windfall from this deal for those other common interests, we see really hardline rhetoric coming out of the Iranian side against Israel, against any potential opening of this deal to do anything else with the United States. And we see this escalation by Russia, supported by the Iranians, which is not exactly a good environment to start forging positive relationships on other regional issues. And then on the U.S. side, what have we seen post-deal? And here I'm not just talking about by folks who don't like the deal or who oppose the deal. We have seen even from pro-deal advocates, and this is across the political spectrum in Washington, an argument that now that this deal is done, even though I was supportive of this deal, now we have to confront Iran in all the other areas. In Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. Because Iran is still the bad guy. And Hillary Clinton gave a speech actually at Brookings not long after the congressional debate was over and pretty much used those terms. And it's across, again, it's the Republicans, that goes without saying. They never liked the deal to begin with. So it's kind of a bipartisan Washington phenomenon where the buzzword again is containment. It's not about, let's see if we can build on all this unprecedented diplomatic engagement we've had with Iran for the past 2 years that actually worked, to see if we can find common ground. We know it's not going to be easy. We know we still have differences, but let's give it a try. Instead, we have both sides kind of digging in. So right now, I'm a little bit pessimistic about any windfall from this deal for broader Iranian engagement. But ultimately, I am optimistic about a different U.S.-Iranian relationship over time, because you do have a country, well-educated population, over 60% of the country is under 30. Just people like yourself in this room. By the way, I'm very impressed with how well-dressed everybody is, and that's very fitting for talking about Iran, because they're often very well-dressed. But many young people who want a different future. And I don't know, I'm not talking about revolution, I don't know what the trajectory of Iran will be, but I know that there is a population that's probably the most pro-American population in the region, and there are areas where we can't do that. So I think the pressures in Iran, we've gotten to this point. We should, instead of being cynical about all the things we can't achieve, because both sides are digging in, I still want to be cautiously optimistic. And I ultimately believe that there are ways forward. And once Andy tells us how we get out of this Syria mess, which I think is one of the biggest reasons we're not getting anywhere with the Iranians, we may see actually things we don't expect to see today. And I think I will end on that more positive note, because so many Middle East talks are so depressing, and I know I was a little bit depressing. So I want to leave you, especially the students in the room who should be hopeful. And the whole point is not just to look at the complexity and crawl under the table, which so many of us want to do when we think about the Middle East these days, but to really figure out what are the possibilities. Not always what are the problems and constraints, but where's the possibility. And I do think with Iran, there are, despite the problems, despite the limitations, there are really, I think, exciting possibilities that I hope we can take advantage of post-deal, and I'm not just talking over the next 6 months to a year, because I think that's going to be a very contentious time, but looking out ahead, next few years, next 5 years, next decade. Thank you.
Thanks, Dahlia. Thanks to Hiram. I'm going to push this podium right off the. It's great to be here. Dahlia and I were actually talking last night. We actually hadn't felt chilly in months, or like these droplets fell out of the sky this morning. We live in Southern California, and it doesn't rain there anymore. So it's been a pleasure. Also, James, I studied the Middle East and terrorism for the last 31 years at CIA, and I will say that after that amount of time, I had the sense that I sort of got it, I understood it, and your presentation really depressed me. But it's time to move from Dahlia's optimism, cautious optimism, to be really, truly depressing, and that's my role. And I'm going to talk mostly about ISIS. And It'll vary a little bit from Syria and Iraq. I'll cover both of those, but most of my stress is going to be on ISIS. I'll give you a little bit of context, a little background, and then I'm going to ask myself 5 or 6 questions. I find that when I ask myself questions, I tend to know the answers better than if you guys ask me. So I'm going to do it that way. So last summer, 14, 15 months ago, this group called ISIS, and we refer to it as ISIS or ISIL or the Islamic State. The Arabs refer to it as Daesh, which is an Arabic acronym. I'll probably refer to it alternatively as either the Islamic State or ISIS. And it came out of the blue, and it took this huge swath of territory in eastern Syria and western Iraq. But there's an antecedent to that, and I want to explain a little bit where they came from and why. And I think it's important to remember, although their headquarters is in Syria, and they've certainly had an enormous impact in Syria, their legacy, this group's legacy, is really in Iraq. There are 2 sorts of people right now at the core of ISIS. One are the clerics and the religious element, the religious warriors. Most of them did time in prison in Iraq while we occupied the country. They became radicalized. They sort of banded together, and I think they developed their strategies for how to take the countries back in the mid-2000s. So they've been thinking about this for 10 years. They've also now banded together with a large number of former Iraqi army officers, guys who fought way back against the Iranians in the 80s. They fought against us as insurgents. They're good, practiced, experienced, tough fighters. They really don't have much of a religious agenda, although that certainly may be developing. What these 2 groups have in common is a real antipathy, and I think Dahlia mentioned this, for Shia, particularly for the Shia government in Baghdad. So we left Baghdad, we left Iraq in our entirety in December of 2011. And at the time, President Obama described Iraq as a reasonably stable, sort of peaceful place. And he wasn't completely wrong. It wasn't what we see today. Well, what happened? Really, the person who bears most of the blame for the deteriorating situation is the prime minister at the time, a Shia named Maliki. And he completely ignored all of our advice. He refused to do any outreach. He refused to listen to the Sunni community. He alienated them, and they became more and more disgruntled. Remember, in the mid-2000s, when Al-Qaeda had a very strong insurgency against our presence, it was the Sunni tribes who banded with us to kick Al-Qaeda out. Maliki sort of forgot that. He distanced himself from them, and it created this sense of real bitterness towards the government. Well, at the same time this was happening in Iraq, you had sort of the perfect storm of a civil war brewing in Syria next door. And the civil war had the same basic elements. In Iraq, you had a Shia majority government abusing a Sunni minority. In Syria, you have a Shia minority government abusing its Syrian majority. So you have these 2 groups of Sunnis band together, create ISIS, and we see what happened. They took the opportunity and really quite strikingly and quickly took over a good portion of the 2 countries. So that's sort of the backdrop. I want to spend some time trying to explain the various sort of aspects of the conflict. And I think we spend too much time looking at what goes wrong. James mentioned the train and equip program for the Syrians. That was a very ill-advised, very unsuccessful program. But when I assess how much progress have we made in the last 14 months, my prism is what would have happened if we hadn't done anything? What would have happened if President Obama listened to a lot of people who said, we've been fighting over there for 15 years, enough already. Too many Americans have died, we've spent way too much money, it's not our problem, let's not get involved. What would have happened? I think the situation today would be substantially worse had we done nothing. And we have to ask ourselves too, why did we get involved? Why did President Obama, who was very reluctant, he ran on a pretty strong platform to get us out of Iraq, not to get us back in. Well, what was happening in June of last year? ISIS was rampaging through the country. They had cornered a group of about 10,000 Yazidis, a Christian minority, at a mountain named Sinjar in northern Iraq. We knew with some certainty that if nothing happened, those people would be killed. The Islamic State referred to them as infidels. They were bound and determined to eliminate the entire Yazidi sect. So had not someone stepped in, we would have had to witness genocide. At the same time, the Islamic State forces were advancing on the Kurds, our allies. They have this great reputation as being among the region's best fighters. Well, it turns out they hadn't actually fought in a long time. And when the Islamic State started pushing against their front lines, the Kurds realized they had poor equipment, they were old, their fighters weren't equipped, and they were taking a lot of losses. So, they came to Washington and said, you got to help us. And all of our Sunni allies in the region, Saudis, the Egyptians,